Hello, my name is Rahul Ananthraman and I work at Sintef Energy as a research scientist. Here today I will be presenting the work on membrane and membrane-assisted liquefaction process for CO2 capture from cement plants. This was work that was done as part of work package 11 in the SEMCAP project. So when we look at membrane-assisted liquefaction process in the SEMCAP process, there seems to be quite a bit of confusion about the fact that the membrane-assisted liquefaction process is very expensive. Excuse me, can we stop 1 minute? Yes. Hello, my name is Rahul Ananthraman and I work at Sintef Energy Research as a research scientist. Today I'll be presenting work on membrane and membrane-assisted liquefaction process for CO2 capture from cement plants. This was work that was done as part of the SEMCAP work package 11. So in this work, what we're going to be doing is identify what are the membrane properties that are required for the membrane-assisted liquefaction process to perform better than what we have seen thus far in the SEMCAP process, and compare it to a membrane, two-stage membrane process for CO2 capture from a cement plant. Okay, to start off with the general background of the cement plant. I guess most of you will know that the cement plant causes 6 to 7% of the global anthropogenic CO2 emissions. And the main thing here is that the CO2 emissions are an inherent part of the cement production process. So what that means is that the way that you can capture the CO2 is mainly by post-combustion capture or oxy-fuel. And in this SEMCAP project, we have been looking at different CO2 capture, post-combustion CO2 capture technologies, and which one of them is the membrane-assisted liquefaction. The CO2 composition is approximately between 18 to 22%. And for this work, we have assumed that the CO2 composition is 22%, which is the low air leakage that we have looked at in the SEMCAP project. Now, with these high CO2 concentration, the membrane-based processes become interesting because membranes work better at higher CO2 concentrations. So membranes are conceptually very simple processes where you have material, permeable material that allows certain components to pass through more than other components that results in the separation of one component over the other. And in this case, we want to separate CO2, so CO2 permeates more than nitrogen in this. And of course, differential, which is done by using a compressor at the feed stage and or with a vacuum at the permeate side. And in a two-stage process, we have two such membranes, one after the other. And this is done basically because to achieve the 95% purity and that is the specification of a two-stage process. Membranes are interesting from the fact that they have a very low environmental impact. It has a very high ease of integration here because the process doesn't require any steam, and also it's a very compact process. So from these perspectives, membranes are really interesting from an environmental perspective and a retrofitability perspective. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, because of the high CO2 concentration, and because membranes, the driving force is the partial pressure differential here for membrane process, it is very attractive here with CO2 concentrations of 22%. Earlier work that we did in the NCCS and big CCS projects, we have seen that membranes are very attractive for these kind of compositions. So this figure shows the cost of membrane-based CO2 capture compared to MEA post-combustion capture at 90% CO2 capture ratio. The important point to note here is that both the membrane and MEA are considered to be at a high maturity level, so they are at the same maturity level here. And what this figure shows is that for a wide range of membrane properties, both selectivities and permeance, the membrane outperforms the MEA by a large margin. So this is what we can say from just the membrane perspective. But then comes the question, what is a liquefaction process and what is a membrane-assisted liquefaction process? So a CO2 liquefaction process is where you take the flue gas, compress it to reasonably high pressure, cool it down to around minus 50, 55 degrees, a little bit above the CO2 freezing point, minus 56, and then the CO2 liquefies and you separate the CO2, and then you have vapor, which you can then purge or recycle back to the process. The interesting part of the CO2 liquefaction process that makes it very advantageous is that there are no chemicals, because the separation is done by phase change. It's a very flexible process where the CO2 products can be provided at conditions that are suitable for either ship or pipeline transport. The process is also very compact because the capture is done at a very high pressure. And an important point to note here, and we'll talk about the next slide, is that it is used as a standard for the oxy-combustion process. So the question comes is there a role for CO2 liquefaction post-combustion capture from cement? And I think you know the answer, yes, because we're talking about, the whole presentation is about that. So yes, it does have a role. But how? As you can see in this figure, we have these two lines. The line below is the 1 bar line, as I'm pointing it with. This is the 1 bar line, and this is the 5.2 bar line, which is the triple point of CO2. So as I mentioned earlier, with the oxy-combustion cases, this is where the oxy-combustion cases are represented by, with approximately 65 to 85% CO2. So these are compressed to above the triple point, where you then liquefy the CO2 and then send it to the CO2 transport conditions. Now for cement, the flue gases are at this point in this curve, so way below where the oxy-fuel conditions are. And what we need to do is to take the cement flue gases that are present in these conditions and move them to the oxy-fuel conditions. And one way to do that is using membrane to provide the bulk separation to get to the oxy-fuel conditions for CO2 compression and liquefaction. So now we talk about the membrane-assisted liquefaction process here, where we have the flue gas, which is compressed, then goes to sulfur removal, and then compressed a bit more. Goes to a cooler, direct contact cooler, and mixed with some recycled gas, which we'll come to later, and goes to the membrane unit, where the CO2 is partially separated from the flue gas. So you have approximately 85 to 92% separation of CO2 here. Then the retentate is cooled, is heated up and then expanded and sent to the stack. The permeate, which is at say, approximately 0.2 bars, is then compressed to 1 atmosphere using vacuum pumps. Cool down. So this is cooled down, knocked out, the water is knocked out, and then sent through a series of compression stages and dehydration to 30 bars, and then it is cooled down to minus 53, 54 degrees, where the CO2 is liquefied. So the liquid CO2 is then, the pressure is lowered further to approximately 8 bar to get the CO2 at the conditions we require, which is you get a CO2 purity of more than 99% here, and is then heated up and pumped to the pressure required. The vapor from the second phase is then recycled back here to before the cooling, while the vapor from the first main separator is heated up and then expanded and recycled back to the membrane unit, as you see here. So this is the general grade of based membrane-assisted liquefaction unit. So what is important here is the CO2 concentration at the interface, because it affects the overall CO2 capture ratio. It affects the amount of CO2 recycled to the membrane, because if you start with a low purity here, in the CO2 liquefaction part is low, which means that there is quite a lot of recycle back to the system, and that in turn will affect the membrane area and the vacuum pump size and work. So the CO2 concentration is very important, and what affects the CO2 concentration is the type of membrane, the pressure differential across the membrane, and the membrane area. And among all these factors, of course, what is the most important is the membrane type, because based on the membrane type, you can then fix the partial pressure difference and the membrane area subsequently. So the membrane type is very important when it comes to ensuring that you have a system with low CO2, a system with very high performance. From the SEMCAP cost estimation work that is done in work package 4, we can see that around 60% of the total cost, direct cost of the membrane-assisted liquefaction is due to the membrane part, or the membrane process itself, where the membrane, the vacuum pump, and the flue gas compressor are the most expensive pieces of equipment, where the three of them together account for 46% of the total direct cost of the total process, which is a significant part. The membrane accounts for 9%, so it's not the most significant, so the compressor and the vacuum pumps are important. So what that tells us is that, yes, the membrane area is important, so we need to have as small membrane areas as possible. But what is probably more important is to make sure we have a slightly lower compression ratio in the compressor, because we can't change the amount of flue gas going in. But what we can do is have a lower compression ratio, which will make the equipment less expensive. And number two is to have as high purity as possible in the permeate side, because that would mean that the flow rate to the vacuum pumps will be low, which would reduce the cost of this system. Thus, you see, try to reduce the membrane area, reduce the pressure fed to the membrane, and as high purity as possible outside, coming from the permeate side. So these are the three things that we want to try to get as a proxy to reducing the cost of the membrane-assisted liquefaction process. So the membranes that were considered in SEMCAP has the properties that are shown here. In SEMCAP, there was no membrane development work, but we used a membrane was tested at one of our partners, TNO, and they got the membrane. They requested membrane from different membrane developers and tested a couple of membranes, and this was one of the membranes that were tested with these properties. The properties are similar to that of MTR membrane, except that the selectivity is lower than the MTR membrane, first generation MTR membrane. So because of that, one of the other membranes we consider in this work is the MTR first generation, where everything remains the same except the selectivity, which is higher at 50. The other membrane that we will consider is the MTR second generation, or the MTR membrane as we call it, and this is what MTR are now selling as their standard performing membrane, with a selectivity of 50 and a CO2 permeance of 5.94 compared to 2.7 from earlier. And then we consider a theoretical membrane, we call it, because we keep the permeance to be 5.94, and the selectivity is set to be at the Robeson plot limit, which comes out to be 79. The other membrane that we will look at is the FSC membrane that has been developed at NTNU and is now being further developed by Air Products, which has a low CO2 permeance but very high selectivity, and an advanced FSC membrane also looked at NTNU with a CO2 permeance of 4 and a selectivity of 135. The advanced FSC membrane, so these numbers have been published as attainable by NTNU, but again, it is still a question mark whether it can be attained, but nevertheless, we thought it was interesting to look at a wide range of membrane properties so that we can identify what kind of properties make it interesting for the membrane-assisted liquefaction process. Okay, so in the next few slides, we look at the results that we obtained from simulating the process in HYSYS with an in-house membrane, multi-component membrane model that we have developed. So the first one we're looking at is the specific work for capture at different membrane feed pressures. Like I said earlier, having a low membrane feed pressure is better for the process because it would reduce the cost. So here we have the case for the SEMCAP membrane, where you get the minimum efficiency or minimum specific work to be around 2.25 to 2.5 bar. This is the specific work for the MTR first generation membrane, where the minimum or the specific capture for work, the minimum for the specific capture moves a bit to the left. The MTR and the MTR first generation membrane are very similar because they have the same selectivity. So from this, you would have noticed that selectivity sort of drives the specific work for capture. So from this, you would realize that the case with a higher selectivity, as we see for 79, drops further. And for the FSC membrane, it is even lower, as we expect from our discussion before. And again, the advanced FSC and the FSC are similar because they have the same selectivity. Right. And as we see, as you increase the selectivity, not only does the specific work for capture decrease, the minimum moves to the left. So you get the minimum work comes at that you can get cheaper, if you will, compression stage or compressor because of a lower pressure ratio that you can design for. So what about the area of the membrane? And we look at that now. So the SEM-cap membrane has the area shown by this dark blue line here. The MTR first generation membrane is slightly higher area required, whereas the MTR membrane is significantly lower than that. So again, as you can see, the MTR, the SEM-cap membrane that we looked at in SEM-cap and the MTR first generation have the same permeance, but the MTR first generation has a higher selectivity, and that causes the membrane area to be higher, whereas the MTR first generation and the MTR membrane have the same selectivity, but the MTR has higher permeance that causes the membrane area to be lower. So from this, again, we can get the generalization that higher selectivity implies higher area for the same permeance, and for the same selectivity, higher permeance means lower area. So from this, we can expect that the theoretical membrane, which has a higher selectivity compared to MTR, has a higher area that's required, slightly higher here. And the FSC membrane, which has a significantly higher selectivity and a very low permeance, requires the highest amount of area. And the advanced FSC would require a lower area than that, nearly the same as that of the MTR first generation case. Right. So based on this, we cannot say that there is a clear winner. However, we can point to a few facts. Like I said before, a higher selectivity membrane implies lower pressure ratio required in the compression stage. A higher selectivity membrane also implies a higher purity out of the membrane in the permeate. So that means lower, possibly lower vacuum pump work that's required, and so lower costs. So these two would seem to indicate that you need to go for a high selectivity membrane. However, as you can see, the membrane area significantly increases if you go for a higher selective membrane. So from these, there is a trade-off to be made, and this can only be done by doing a complete techno-economic analysis, which we will do later as part of another project. Okay, so we've talked about the membrane-assisted liquefaction process and briefly about the two-stage membrane process. So let's see how they compare against each other. So this is the specific work required for the different membrane types for the membrane-assisted liquefaction process. And the two-stage membrane process requires higher work than that of the membrane-assisted liquefaction process. A point to note here that it is not just for these membranes that are considered, but it will always be the case. The two-stage membrane process will always require higher work than the membrane-assisted liquefaction process. We have done work as part of the SEM-cap project and also in the big CCS, NCCS project, where we have proved based on thermodynamic analysis that this will always be this case, irrespective of the membrane type. And that is an important point to note. So it's always better if you're looking from an energy perspective to go for a membrane-assisted liquefaction process. And then when we come to look at the area, these are the areas required for the different membrane types for the membrane-assisted liquefaction process. For a two-stage membrane process, we see that there is no, or it doesn't appear there to be a pattern, whereas there is. So the MTR membrane actually requires a higher membrane area for the two-stage membrane process. FSC membranes, and the reason for both these cases is that they have very low permeance. So it's 2.7 in the case of the MTR first generation and 2 in the case of FSC. And this means that when you talk about cases with low permeance, the two-stage membrane has slightly lower membrane area than a membrane-assisted liquefaction process. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we would need to do a full techno-economic analysis to actually compare the two to provide a definitive answer, sort of to say when a two-stage membrane process or a membrane-assisted liquefaction process is better than a two-stage membrane process. Okay, so with that, we come to the last slide and the summary. The membrane-assisted liquefaction performance and cost will vary significantly with membrane performance. It is critical to identify suitable membrane properties for the process for a given flue gas composition, because depending on the flue gas composition, the type of membrane which will be optimum will vary, as we've seen. And the membrane-assisted liquefaction outperforms the two-stage membrane process for post-combustion capture. And there is a thermodynamic proof irrespective of the membrane type of performance. And that is only for the specific work requirement. Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, the techno-economic analysis of a membrane process presented in this work will be performed and compared in a subsequent project. Thank you very much for your attention.